So what we need to use is our root parameter here to pass this as the parameter to our load activity method. But first of all, let's see what we can use, and what we'll need to do is just get rid of this particular error first of all, so that we can take a look at the properties that we get inside this component. And I'm just going to close down the others in this. And for our activity details, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a return and just say return h1 and activity details. So this is what we're going to return instead of all of this, just temporarily, so that we get past the error, so that we can take a look at what we have to work with when we go ahead and go and get our activity. So if we attempt to click on an activity, well, nothing really happens. And whilst it appears nothing's happening, if we scroll down, we can actually see our activity details component is actually loading as well. It's just buried at the bottom of the page. So what we need to do is we need to go back and give our activities inside our app.tsx file. We need to give this an exact path as well, just like we did with the home components. And then we should be able to see our activity details. If that didn't work for you, just make sure you give your page a refresh before clicking around, but we should find now that we get taken to this particular component when we click on the link. Now let's open up the React DevTools and let's take a look at our components. And what we want to do is take a look at our activity details component and take a look at the properties we have available inside here. Now when we're using a root inside React Router, it makes these properties available, and these are our routing properties. We have access to a history object, and this allows us to do various things with our history in our browser. We can push a route onto it. We can say go back, we can say go forward, etc. We also have a location object which gives us our current location with the path in this case. And what we also have is this match object, and inside this match object we get access to a params object, and this is our root parameters. So we can see that we get access to the ID in this case, and this is what we can use to go ahead and load our individual activity and send this particular ID as a parameter. So let's make use of this, and let's head back to our activity details components. And what we need to do here is bring in our properties so that we get access to them in our destructured props. Now what we can use for this, and I'm just going to add a type, is we can use the root component props, and we can go and get these from React Router. And if I go and take a look at the definition of this, then what we can see is that our root component props gives us access to our history, location, and match properties. So I can destructure what we're looking for inside our parameters here for our activity details, and what we want is the match object in this particular case. So what we want to do is we want to use the effect from React because we want to do something when our component mounts. So what I'll do is say use effects, and we'll bring this in from React, and inside here we'll add the function, and we'll also bring in the load activity from our activity store. And what we'll do is we'll say load activity, and then we can pass in match.params.id. But here we have a problem because our params object has no idea that we've called our parameter ID. Now it is called ID because in our app component we set this particular parameter to ID, but this could be anything. We could call this activity ID, and then this would be the parameter that we get inside our props. But since we called it ID, we need to tell our root component props that it can expect to find an ID parameter inside the match.params object. And what we can do to achieve that is this roots component props can take a type parameter as well. So what we'll do is we'll create an interface and we'll call it detail params, and we'll just specify an ID of type string as the parameter, and then we can pass that detail params as an additional type parameter to our root component props. And now our params has access to this ID property. Now we only want this load activity to be run once when we mount this component. So what we need to do is we need to pass in an array of dependencies here, and we do need to pass in the load activity as the dependency. Remember, if we leave off the dependencies, then this is going to run every single time the component re-renders, and that's not the impact we want here. We just want this to run once when the component mounts. So what we also want to do, because we set the loading initial flag in our load activity method, we also want to bring this in as well. So I'm just going to bring in loading initial and just reformat. And inside our return statement here, instead of displaying this h1, what we can display is we can say if loading initial, then return, and we'll pass in our loading component, and we'll give it some contents, and we'll say loading activity ... And let's go and make sure this has actually worked. And it's telling us we've got an error here, but this is coming from our activity dashboard, and we don't want to display either our activity details or our activity form on our activity dashboard. So what we also need to do is go back to our activity dashboard, and what we can do is we can actually remove what's going on inside our right hand grid column here, because we're not actually displaying this anymore on the right hand side. And let's just remove this in its entirety, and what we'll do is we'll just replace this with some placeholder text of what will be going there later on, and that's going to be our activity filters. And this is going to be a placeholder for some time, and it should remove that particular error that we've just seen. So if I just refresh the page, we're still actually seeing an error, but the reason we're seeing this particular error is down to our activity store state. And when we initialize the activity observable, so I'm just going to open up the activity store, and our activity, when we initialize it, its initial value is undefined. And because when our component initializes the activity details page, it's going to see this as undefined and then just immediately say, nope, I don't have a category property on undefined, and we see this particular error. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to add an additional check inside our activity details page, and we want to say if loading initial or the activity is undefined in this case, then we'll return our loading component, and if not, we'll return our activity. And sure enough, now we get our activity, and the styling at the moment, we will make an effort to improve this later. Now we will be picking up styling in the next section, and for now all we want to do is make sure we concentrate on routing and making sure our components are rendering when we go to a specific route. So now that we have our activity details loaded, what we also need to do is adjust the various other things inside here. And if I click on this cancel button, well, now I'm just going into a loading spinner loop. But what I really want to do with this cancel button is redirect back to the activities page. And what we'll take a look at next is how we can navigate via our code instead of via React Router links.